Peace Worker Radio, coming to you from WCCR, Voice and Vision of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thanks for joining us on this 11th of July, 2016. The events on the last several days of last week, the shootings in Dallas, the chaotic situation there, the news front in reference to the preparations for the Democratic and Republican conventions and the chaos surrounding the candidates and the disillusionment of large portions of the electorate, and of course a theoretical basis about why all of this is taking place now, at this particular time. Not that it was planned. Some of it is planned. Some of it is planned with a different concept in mind, namely the materialist development of history, a concept we will be speaking about in reference to these developments. This is not accidental. The development of history, not as a history of great men making great speeches or fighting great battles, but rather the conflict which takes place in the class structure brought about by the capitalist system initiated in the Middle Ages. We hear a lot of conversation by the candidate, the very progressive candidate Bernie Sanders, in reference to the need to establish a political revolution. The political revolution is taking place around us in cities like Dallas, but also in the stealing of the elections by Hillary Clinton and the horrific prospect of having a candidate such as Donald Trump, a real possibility of having a incredibly incompetent, reactionary, if not neo-fascist, bully, misogynist, racist in the White House is a horrific prospect under any circumstances, but one developing at a time point in which so many other questions, the question of open carry, the question of police brutality against blacks, the question of a police state, the question of continued imperialistic wars by one U.S. President administration after another, and the fact of the disintegration of the basis of livelihood for millions, tens of millions of Americans, and the prospect of that not changing under a Präsidentschaft either of Hillary Clinton or much worse than that, theoretically, that of a Donald Trump. Let's begin by looking at the question of the stealing of elections and how that has actually manifested itself in public media. We thank the various organizations for the right to comment on their newscasts on this show. Thank you, and without further ado, let's get started.
On election fraud. Yeah, more. Yeah, look, I don't want to be reading this either, all right? I spent my whole life avoiding math, okay? And now I have to read exit poll data? You, other media. Other media, you for making me do this, all right? If you were doing your... I avoid math so much that I once said no to a menage a trois, all right? I was like, how many breasts do I have to pleasure? I'm out. Luckily, someone else does the equations, but still, I have to read them. And people are like, now people are like, let it go, right? The race is over, give it up, let it. This is not over, okay? If someone goes missing, we will search for them for months, sometimes years, to find, especially if it's an attractive white girl. Oh man, our media will leave no stone unturned to find her. But here we are, witnessing the kidnapping of our election process, and a couple of weeks after the last primary, we should just pack it up and walk away. No. You can have this election when you pry it from my cold dead hand. So here's an update from...
So this is, of course, Lee Camp and his take on the election. Thanks so much for the presentation of this piece.
California. A lawsuit has been filed by Election Justice USA to stop the certification of California's primary results. It's based on the violation of the right to vote. The intent of the voter was compromised when voters were not given proper ballots. Because of this, high numbers of write-in and provisional ballots have been removed from the counting process. Something else you might find interesting. On Election Day, Hillary Clinton beat Sanders 56.8% to 43.2%, a huge amount. And a lot of media sources announced that it was over. However, in the updates coming from the Secretary of State since Election Day, Sanders leads 51.1% to 48.9%. Even the Washington Post said since Election Day, Clinton has added 692,629 votes. Sanders has added 703,176 votes. That's a shift of 15% compared to what was counted on election. How the could the Election Day tallies be so different from the after-election day tallies? Well, it certainly can't be the voting machines. I mean, they're rock solid, all right? They're rock solid. It's like they're like only 10 or 15 years old, and half of them are like a Teddy Ruxpin with a touchscreen plugged into its butt crack. But still, I'm sure it's not them. So if it's not them, then that just means that Sanders voters were systematically forced to fill out provisional ballots, which were not counted on the night of the election, which is still really f***ed up. Look, if you believe this is a conspiracy theory, then great. Show me the proof the machines are accurate and we'll all move on with our lives. Oh. What's that? Oh, you can't show me because the machines are a black box of mystery. Isn't that nice? Isn't that a news story in and of itself? No way to prove our election is genuine? That's one hell of a story. That's better than a missing white girl. All right?
So Lee Camp has obviously hit on a reality that tens of thousands of individuals have seen in the United States during the primaries, and commented on here at Peace Worker Radio by Paul Stephen Stone, a guest that we've had on the show a number of times. Stone, and we recommend highly looking at Paul Stephen Stone's political ads, 49 of them excellent in character about the election, the stealing of the election, the realities of the difference in the candidates, and why Bernie Sanders is by far the only candidate who has integrity and would have an excellent opportunity of beating Trump in the election. So Camp, speaking to these issues, again in a humorous fashion, brings up the reality that the elections have been stolen, the primaries have been stolen, and continues along this path, clarifying why and how it was actually done. We'll get back to that.
That is huge! But don't worry, those of you who are diehard Bernie supporters, Hillary Clinton is doing everything she can to win you over. She's She's just trying so hard. For example, last week, the Democratic Party's official platform was decided, and they backed fracking, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Israeli occupation. Oh, that sounds like the Republican platform. And didn't Hillary Clinton herself say she was against the TPP and basically against fracking? Then why would, because the DNC platform is like a magic mirror that reflects back Hillary's true inner self. Which is disgusting. It's gross in there, all right? It's not the bullshit plastic smile she puts on for the public. This is what normal people look like, right? I feel your pain. Also thrown away at the DNC meeting were proposals to support a carbon tax, single-payer health care, and a $15 minimum wage tied to inflation. Those were all disregarded. Unfortunately, the meeting got a little awkward when the private security accidentally let in someone with a moral center.
If we can't say a word about TPP, if we can't talk about Medicare for all, listen. If the greatest prophetic voice dealing with impending ecological catastrophe can hardly win a vote, and if we can't even acknowledge occupation as something that's real in the lives of a slice of humanity, I don't care what color they are, I don't care what culture, whatever, then it just seems to me there's no way in good conscience I can say, take it to the next stage. I wasn't raised like that. That's not my calling. It'd be a violation of my own limited sense of moral integrity and spiritual conscience. And it's not an attempt to downplay anybody else, but that's how I roll.
That's how I roll. Professor West, you were supposed to check your moral convictions at the door. All right? Bringing ethical core into a meeting of the DNC is like, it's like wearing cleats in a bouncy castle. It doesn't end well, and it ruins the whole party for everybody else. This debate over the platform of the Democratic National Committee showed the DNC's true colors. Here's another example. After everyone agreed that America has to get to 100% clean energy by 2050 to keep alive, here's how the committee responded to actual ways to get there. A carbon tax, voted down 7-6. A ban on fracking, voted down 7-6. An effort to keep fossil fuels in the ground, voted down 7-6. A measure to mandate that federal agencies even weigh the climate impact of their decisions, voted down 7-6. A plan to keep fossil fuel companies from taking private land by eminent domain, voted down 7-6. And then Bill McKibben of 350.org wrote, "We did, however, reach unanimous consent on more bike paths." Yes!
So it's terrific, terrific show that Lee Camp puts on. We're very thankful to be able to put this forward to our viewers today. The points that he's making are right on target, ones that have been made by others as well. The crisis that we have in the U.S. Political system have been brewing for a very long period of time. The crisis seems to be that the Republican Party has convinced the American electorate that although they blocked time and time again any legislation of the Obama administration, if it's budgetary, they would drive the situation and prohibit the budget to be voted on until it was necessary to approve a last-ditch effort, pressing positions from the Obama administration, gaining some type of brinkmanship, making their power known in the blockage of bills, blockage of the financial structure, driving the financial ability of the U.S. government simply to even to make payments. threatening to have the U.S. government default on its financial responsibilities time and time again, blocking legislation and voting on legislation which would have been essential for the normal functioning of governments, and then having the immense audacity of claiming that they're working in the interests of the American people. They are no longer, the Republican Party no longer works in the interest of the American people. They are simply using tactics to block necessary legislation and necessary functioning of government, and then bringing forth candidates such as Donald Trump, who is a bigot, a racist, a misogynist, and a very, very poor businessman, to say the least. The question of his leadership we will simply leave to an examination of what programs he doesn't bring any programs forward. He rants about what he's going to do and about making America great again. It's pathetic, a pathetic position that Trump brings forward. However, what we are interested in today is looking at why this crisis is coming about now at this time. We would like to begin this part, as we discussed about 14 days ago, in the idea of socialism, called the fact that the class struggle between the various classes is what determines history, the development of history. Not what great men say, not what battles they fight, not what decisions they make, or who they meet and have lunch with. That is not what determines the development of history. History does not repeat itself, as the statement goes by so many historians, saying that we've seen very similar events in the past, shootings which take place, or battles, wars which take place. They say the situations are similar, and similar methods are necessary to win those wars, and how these battles, these wars are to be fought. The reality is that history has been studied and put on a analytical level 150 years ago by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and has been examined and re-examined by brilliant philosophers, historians, two of which were up until recently active here in the Boston area. That's Howard Zinn in his People's History of the United States, and the eminent philosopher and linguist working at MIT, Noam Chomsky. Also using, while Chomsky is a declared, not a declared historic materialism or socialist, but rather defines his position more in the field of anarchy. The reality is that these analytical positions are, for the most part, and for all intents and purposes, an excellent way of determining how the events of history taking place today can be looked at. And let's do that without further ado. The manifesto to the Communist Party written I believe, in 1847, in late of 1847, published in 1848, a time in which a revolutionary moment in European history. Revolutions were taking place, peaceful revolutions were taking place in Germany, and warlike revolutions taking place in France at this time. The preamble is an interesting position in reference to this, the manifesto of the Communist Party. A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism was the text that was given. All the powers of old Europe are entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich, and other French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against the reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. And one, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. And two, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish. That was the manifesto of the Communist Party, and the history, as one can see it on the page. We recommend everyone take the opportunity to look at this online under www.marxist.org/archive. A tremendous set of materials and historical documents about communism, socialism, and historical materialism, which is basically what we'll be speaking about today. The idea of historical materialism is that history develops itself, and this is what the bourgeois and the proletariat, the next section, developed in this piece into the Marxist encyclopedia, will clarify. The idea is not that wars, hate, suppression is what history is about. History is about the fact that the conflict of class struggle, as various classes come about due to the production techniques, the methods of production, and the ownership of production. Different groups come about, classes. These classes struggle for a betterment of their position, and dislodging of one group is basically the driving force of history. The dislodging of one group in a particular moment of using the means of production and the ownership of this production, the kinds of goods and services produced, is basically the driving reality. Together, through the conflict of classes, each epic develops with various classes. As we mentioned in an earlier description of this, through history, the various kinds of societies, agrarian societies, then slave societies, then production societies. For instance, after the Industrial Revolution, the use of machines and labor, unionized, non-unionized labor, and the usurping of the added value by the capitalist class who owned exclusively the means of production. The poor proletariat did not own the means of production, but rather only had the opportunity of selling their labor in order to have the ability to earn a living and be able to support and allow their family the barest necessities of life. Let's get a look basically at what the manifesto then continues to say in reference to this. The two classes then in this case would be the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. Free men and slave patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of the society at large or in a common ruin of the contending classes. In either epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold graduation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves, and the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate graduations. This is basically what we're speaking about, the difference in classes and the function that these classes take in that particular society, determine which conflicts develop, the nature of the conflicts, and depending upon the tactics, the realities, the means of how the battles can be fought and how the struggle ends determines how that epoch in history then is solved, and what other classes develop and which other struggles emanate from that conflict. The modern bourgeoisie or bourgeois society has sprouted from the ruins of the feudal society, has not done away with the class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, and new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch Marx is speaking about the 1850s. Our epoch, the epoch of bourgeois, possesses, however, the distinct feature it has simplified class antagonisms. A society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing one another, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That is the exact position of today. The billionaire class and the top 5% wage earners, this very, very small elite control more than 50% of all of the wealth in the United States. The rest of the 95% of America owns less than 40% of the wealth. So we have a massive concentration of wealth at the top by very few, the billionaire class and the multimillionaire class, those Donald Trumps and Hillary Clintons and the Koch brothers financing the elections due to the decision by the Supreme Court and Citizens United, allowing these types of decisions to be made, allowing the class interests of the elites to rule over the poor and the working poor. We continue the analysis here. From the discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East India Company, we're speaking about the 14, 15, 16 centuries. Actually, the 16th century in this case. The feudal system of industry in which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. A division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of the division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant modern industry, the place of the industrial middle class or industrial millionaires, in this case billionaires today. The leaders of the whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeoisie. Modern industry has established a world market for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. The development has, in its turn, rejected on the extension of industry and the proportion of industry, commerce, navigation, etc. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accomplished by a corresponding political advance in that class, as opposed an opposed class under the sway of the feudal nobility and armed self-governing association in the medieval commune. Here, independent urban republic, as in Italy or Germany, where taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France, etc. The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, however, is not. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly thrown asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hereto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relationship. This is the reality that we've seen in the struggles in the subprime mortgage meltdown, in speculation, in the degradation of the family. Certainly those struggling to pay their mortgage from the meager wages brought forth in late capitalism, with a floundering economy, with the trade bills put forth allowing factories to be closed here in the United States, throwing wage earners off out of jobs, moving jobs into third world countries, producing goods and services much more cheaply and re-importing them into the United States. The jobs are taken from the American wage earner and given to even more seriously oppressed wage earners in China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia. These is the reality of the development of these types of oppression by the ruling elites, and nothing new, as we've seen by the decision-making in what we've just read. Let's get back, however, to the election fraud, because this will build the line that will continue in reference to how the crisis has developed through the subprime mortgage meltdown, the loss of jobs, the oppression by the Democratic and Republican parties, and how this consequence will manifest itself today. We'll look basically through the lens, as soon as we've had this part from the Lee Camp Show.
Yes, the revolution is here. I decided to help them out a little. I did a little city planning for these future bike paths. Here's the future bike path in New Orleans. Here's the future bike path in Los Angeles. Here's the future bike path in Boston. Future bike path in Nebraska. And here's the future bike path in Mississippi. It's actually pretty much the same as normal, except that gay couple had to steal the bike because no one would sell it to them. Point is, the DNC and Hillary Clinton may at times talk a good game, but they will lead us off an ecological cliff, just like the Republicans will. The difference is that we'll go off that cliff on a bicycle. Ching, 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 ching. So this is why it's that much more infuriating that this election was stolen from Bernie Sanders. And it will happen again and again and again until we stand up against it. Coming to you from Washington, D.C., the belly of the beast is redacted tonight. Take the news from behind. Brexit has been all over the news this week. As you surely know by now, Britain chose to leave the European Union in a vote that sent shockwaves through most of the world and quickly caused most Americans to Google, what is Brexit and can I catch it from sitting on the lap of a shopping mall Santa Claus? He was the understudy, too. Here's my question about the British people voting to leave the European Union. Why did they get to vote on that? There's all kinds of we'd love to vote on here in the U.S. How about the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Can we vote on that? Yeah? Let's put that to a national vote. How about fracking? Let's vote on that. How about the Keystone Pipeline? Can we vote on that? Marijuana legalization? Or money in politics? Or GMOs? Or weather and culture should have to wear a Silence of the Lamb muzzle? Should be legal to shoot an elephant tranquilizer into a rental car employee and then tattoo on his forehead because he knows why. He knows why. You know why. Why don't we get to vote on all kinds of crap? Of course, course, this doesn't always work. Like, if we had a vote on whether we should have the NFL or have public education, the NFL would win big time. And then we would have a nation of absolute idiots playing football all day. So it wouldn't be that different. It'd be pretty similar. I'm not saying national referendums always are good, but still, why did they get to vote? Anyway, the other aspect I haven't heard on our mainstream media is that apparently Google and Facebook tried to influence the vote. They both put forward efforts to get people to vote for remaining in the EU. And sure, maybe that doesn't bother people that much, but, you know, especially since they lost the side they were pushing for. But what about when they're manipulating every other election? What about if Google decides they want Donald Trump to be the next president? How do you feel about that? What if they decide they want a rental car? God.
So we've seen that this is an interesting position brought forward by our colleague Lee Camp in his show Redacted tonight, and we thank him for that possibility here. The Brexit vote is an example of the power of the United States using its political fifth column, the Great Britain, to manipulate their exit from the European Union at a time in which a much larger crisis is going on, that of the immigration of refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Libya and Sudan, probably Somalia as well, Ethiopia perhaps. The massive waves, primarily from Syria and Iraq, however, of 2.5, 3 million, as many as estimates are as high as 20 million refugees worldwide seeking asylum, seeking entry into a country where they would be able to live in relative stability, is part of the crisis that the United States manipulates and manages at this moment, driving them through conducting war in an intensified manner against what they call ISIS. Now they have been called Saddam Hussein 15 years ago under the Bush administration, then Al-Qaeda, now ISIS. The reality is that these forces, the war against these peoples, against these groups, is a manipulative tool to force political change. In this case, the effort to break down the European Union, which is a immensely powerful trading partner and competitor of the United States in reference to control and use of technologies and trade, and a combined budget at least as large as that of the United States. So it's in the interest of American bourgeois, of the ruling elites here, the billionaires, to manipulate political changes, to weaken political opponents, and establish advantages for the elites here. We'll see that this does not advantage the poor and working poor. The crisis that we would like to go into here in reference to the conflict and class conflict and the disintegration and development of revolutionary situations is shown in the crisis in Dallas, the shooting of 13 persons, and then the killing of the shooter, although he was severely wounded, and although negotiations had taken place per telephone with him for over 2 hours, it was completely clear where he was. It must have been clear that he was wounded. He wrote apparently in his own blood statements on the wall where he was in the garage, where he was dying. So we question whether or not the immense amount of brutality used here, and the complete lack of organization by the Dallas police, by the police in general, although since the early 1960s, in which a shooter in Texas had killed a number of people, it must have been clear that these types of events take place in public areas, and the police need some type of tactic to be able to structure reasonably quickly their activities and how to protect civilians. We'll see that this has not been the case, and that the crisis and the actions of the police were anything but coordinated, and the many rounds of munitions which had been shot in this chaos that went on apparently for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, endangering many lives, is a crisis that should have been avoided, a structure which should have been found, but the coordination of the police, the vast amounts of money sucked out of public coffers in cities. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States, all hierarchically organized, with a head, with sergeants, with captains, with sergeants, with detectives, and these literally hundreds of billions of dollars that go out each year to police departments. One would have thought that a structure would have been in place to help the public avoid getting caught in these types of events, and police force, as we'll see, running and shooting apparently without a plan. This is the event that we will recap here.
Let's get right to the new developments in the massacre of those 5 police officers in Dallas, an act of madness that has injected a whole new level of anger and fear into America's already fraught debate over race and law enforcement.
Overnight, large street demonstrations have been going on in cities across our country. The protest movement against fatal police shootings of Black people is not slowing down, even after the events in Dallas where 5 officers were murdered. And the tension is evident. We want you to look at the social video from an overnight demonstration in Baton Rouge. You can see an officer pulling his gun on protesters.
In some places, though, communities are really coming together. This indelible image out of Dallas, a police car there.
News presents brutal shooting caught on camera.
Security video catches South Carolina T firing a gun.
We have not been able to find this particular piece that exemplifies the chaos which took place on the streets of Dallas. We feel that that is a central crisis due to the planning which police officers should be able to conduct to avoid the crisis which took place in Watertown, for instance, in which thousands of rounds of ammunition apparently were fired, and then against in Dallas, endangering civilians, endangering innocent bystanders by police running around, as we had seen in that part of that video clip, 5 officers lined up with their pistols ready to point around the corner and shoot. The fact that the shooter in this case had been seriously wounded and was in telephone contact with police. The crisis in this, similar to the shooting which took place in Orlando, is an example of the police not being organized in a way so that civilians can confidently have faith that their lives will not be endangered, even to a greater extent through the police being brought to a scene. To this extent, we are calling from this position to have all of the transcripts, all of the communication, all of the evidence, now that both shooters in the Orlando case and in the Dallas case, both of the shooters are killed. The investigation is, for this intents and purposes, ended. And we're calling now for all of the evidence that the police collected, all of the conversations with the shooters, all of the evidence that the police have brought together, which had taken place at that time, to be made public, so that it's possible for a public review of the actions of the police in both of these cases in which many lives were lost. This is not a question of police independence. This is not a question of the interests of finding other shooters. The shooter apparently in Dallas said he acted alone. Apparently it is the belief that in Orlando the same was the case. The police, so is the position here, should not be allowed to determine completely when and what they allow to be made public. The public has an interest because they pay the salaries of the police through tax money. The public has an interest because the public is endangered by the lack of effective tactics by the police during a time in which these types of events take place. We've seen both in the Dallas event, and there's footage, many hours perhaps of footage in which individuals had used their cameras to show the chaos on the streets, the chaos brought forth by the shooting which had taken place, by the lack of an effective response by police, by an effective method of moving forward to help instill a sense of purpose in their activities and to help lead civilians away from that carnage. The particularly evident were the hundreds, if not thousands of shots, rounds of ammunition fired. The question is, again, how many rounds of ammunition were fired from which weapons by the police, and an examination of anyone killed in that shootout as to what type of munitions were used and from what guns these deaths occurred. It is not entirely in the interests of the police to determine when this information or what part or what amount of evidence is dispersed. This is in the interests of the public, and we're calling here from this position from Peace Worker Radio that both in the Orlando case, because the shooter was killed, and both in the Dallas case in which the police determined how they killed the shooter. The police are making the determination about how the person dies and under what circumstance he dies, and then monopoly of all the information regarding how that came about. We understand that it's of an interest and controversial perhaps here in this position, but we feel confident that these types of chaotic situations on the streets or places in which large numbers of civilians and innocent bystanders are trapped, that the police cannot determine every aspect of it moving forward without having a plan in place which secures the integrity of the moment. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again at this position next week. Good night.